In Chapter 5, we start to see some of the fun things you can do with price controls and quotas meddling with the markets. Specifically, there are two kinds of government intervention in the market, and you'll see that these are actual real-life examples, which I think makes this chapter pretty interesting. We get into the fun part of microeconomics. Let's start with why governments want to control prices. It's mainly because the equilibrium price may not necessarily please either the buyers or the sellers. Therefore, the government imposes price controls, which are either how high or how low a market price may go. A price ceiling is the highest price that sellers are allowed to charge for a good or service. Now, and price floor is the opposite. It's the minimum price that buyers are required to pay for a good or service. Now, price ceiling typically you'll see in such a thing as rent control. In New York City, for example, where everyone remembers the popular sitcom Friends. The reason all of those 20 and 30 somethings were able to live in such a fashionable neighborhood in New York City. And none of them, except for, was it Chandler, actually seemed to have a great job. Maybe Joey did. Anyway, they were all able to afford this fabulous apartments, and it was because of rent control. But I digress. So let's look at the market for monthly rent and quantity of apartments in New York City. Without government controls, it looks like we have an equilibrium price of $1,000 per month per apartment. I know that's kind of ridiculous, but let's just go with it. And then 2 million apartments rented. Now, suppose the government put in this case, New York City, put in a price ceiling, the highest that any landlord can make their rent is $800. So look what happens. At $800 on point A here, the equilibrium is $1,000. Point A on the supply and point B on the demand curve is the point at $800. And it looks like we have a shortage, a housing shortage, because the amount demanded at $800 is a lot more than the amount willing to be supplied at $800. As you see, $1,000 was the original equilibrium price. So suppliers aren't as willing to rent their apartments at $200 less a month. And you can see that there will, in a minute here, that there's going to be some dead weight loss in total surplus because of this shortage. There's inefficient allocation to customers, wasted resources such as, since there's a shortage of apartments, people are spending more time looking for them, for example. Inefficiently low quality rent-controlled apartments are notorious for not being having upkeep done to them. Why should landlords put costly repairs into the apartments if people are going to rent them anyway? And of course, there are the black market for goods and services. A lot of under-the-table deals where, say, I'll rent you the apartment for $800 a month, but you have to pay me $200 a month in a service fee or something under the table. Or I'm going to rent it to someone else who would buy it anyway or rent it anyway. So that triangle here is the deadweight loss from the fall in the number of apartments rented. You could see that someone is willing to pay $1,200 a month. You can remember willingness to pay. And $800 is the most that someone can pay. So these people were missing out on this transaction here. That's the deadweight loss to society. These transactions are not happening because of the price ceiling. So you could see before rent control, there's consumer surplus and producer surplus divided equally like it should be. After rent control, with the price ceiling in place, consumer surplus gets a little higher actually, but there also is some deadweight loss. But when you shift from 1,000 to 800, all this part is consumer surplus. All that surplus goes to the consumers. The producers lose out, actually. You would think that would help the producers because they're always going to have an apartment rented, but it doesn't help them at all. So, again, it goes back into the inefficiency. People who want the good badly, that person who is willing to pay $1,200 for an apartment and willing to pay that high price isn't able to get it. And maybe someone who doesn't really care as much about the good and is only willing to pay up to $800 would get it anyway. So that's not an efficient allocation to consumers. Again, with the wasted resources, people spend money, effort, time to cope with the shortages, looking for the apartments. And again, the low quality that I mentioned before, and the black market. Price ceilings, such as rent control in New York, gives a small minority of renters much cheaper housing than they would have get anyway. And these people that benefit typically are better organized and more vocal about their support than those who are harmed by this. And in New York City, for example, these price ceilings have been in effect for a long time. So there may not be a realistic idea out there of what would happen without them. I don't remember what the book said, but it gave an just astronomical figure for what the real rent in Manhattan would be without rent control. Price floors is the exact opposite. Sometimes governments intervene to push market prices up instead of down. The minimum wage is a legal price floor on the wage rate. And this may not be intuitive as it should be. With the labor market, households supply the labor. So you and I are the supply. And businesses demand the labor. The price of labor is the wage, and the quantity is the employment level, the number of workers or hours or some measure of labor. Price floors are intended to help some people, for minimum wage especially, but there are some predictably undesirable side effects. I wish they would stick with minimum wage here, but they go into butter, the market for butter. So maybe the government wants to help out farmers. So let's look at, without any government controls, equilibrium price is $1 per pound of butter and 10 million pounds of butter. And suppose a price floor is put into place. You know what? This might be a good time to go over price floor and ceiling. As you hear the words floor and ceiling, you would think that floor would be on the bottom and ceiling would be on the top. Graphically, it just doesn't make sense. So you'll see, it's apparent that a price floor means the price is the lowest it can go, so it is above equilibrium price. Now, the price floor can be set below. It doesn't matter because equilibrium price is already above it. So what good does it say, okay, the lowest you can charge for something is 60 cents. No one's going to charge 60 cents anyway because they can be getting $1 for the butter. So to reiterate, price floor, usually on the top, above equilibrium price and quantity. Price ceiling, below equilibrium price and quantity. So going back to the effects of a price floor, that would be a surplus of 3 million pounds caused by this price floor. If the lowest you can charge is $1.20, consumers are only going to demand 9, and suppliers are going to want to supply 12 million pounds. So there's this big surplus. And again, there's the same inefficiencies as you would see in a price ceilings. Deadweight loss, inefficient allocation, wasted resources, inefficiently high quality, and the temptation to break the law by selling it below the legal price floor that's there. So see here again, we see the deadweight loss. It doesn't matter if there's a price ceiling or a price floor, the deadweight loss is always going to be the end result, as is a decreased quantity. So that's something to keep in mind. It's the same effect, and just how drastic is the effect depends on the severity of your price ceiling or price floor. So just it's the exact same thing as the price ceiling, just a different way. Those are willing to sell the good at a lower price are not always able to sell it. Price floors lead to inefficiency in goods that are inefficiently high quality. The book gives a good example of international airline travel, where there was the lowest that someone could charge, an airline could charge. No one could go lower, and obviously airlines like to compete on price. If they can't go lower, what do? They start giving these extravagant meals that no one wants anyway. So that's really inefficient. And also, there's another way to control quantity. This is different than a price ceiling or a floor, and that's the quota. And that's a quantity control, not a price control. And that's the highest quantity of some good that can be bought or sold. And there's a good example is the taxi medallion, again, in New York City. It's like New York's the center of the world or something, right? And so this license gives the owner the right to supply the good. And we'll see there's a demand price and a supply price. So here's the market for taxi rides without government controls. $5 fare per ride, $10 or 10 million rides per year. If you were to put a quota, the most we can put, and you could see the quantity control goes from the quantity axis instead of the price control here, coming from the price side. So with a quota, there's still that deadweight loss and a wedge between the demand price and the supply price of a good. So the price paid by buyers ends up being higher than what was received by sellers. And that difference is the quota rent. And the book makes a good point with the taxi medallions. It doesn't matter who owns the medallion. So say I own the medallion and rent it out to someone. That difference in price is the quota rent. If I keep that medallion, it's as if I'm renting it to myself. So there's some lost deadweight loss there to myself, because some mutually beneficial transaction don't occur. There's also some incentives, again, for some illegal black market activities, a lot of unlicensed cab drivers, for example. And I think that's mainly the highlights of Chapter 5. Again, I think this is a fairly interesting chapter, and as is Chapter 6 when we get into elasticity. So I will see you then at Chapter 6.